Hello, hello, hello. Since some of you asked on Reddit and elsewhere how I made the scene where I tracked some 3D footage onto my coffee table in my living room, I decided to make a tutorial and show you how it's done. I will split off this tutorial in different parts, like the After Effects part and the 3D part, and in the 3D part the actual setup of the geometry nodes, so you can follow along and skip to the parts which you need. So let us start. This is buffering. But essentially I tracked the clip here in After Effects, exported the data into Blender via an add-on, and built my scene around this. It's not perfect, but the add-on works quite well if you don't do too complicated moves. Like for example here it's like off the table. You don't want this originally, but I made the scene in like 4 hours completely, so including rendering, so I couldn't be bothered to fix this because I wanted to get it out and start with the next idea. Also, a lot of people ask how I got the lighting such perfectly, so I will show you this. It's quite easy, but let's start off from the beginning. So we want to make a new project in After Effects and start with a new composition, and for this we want to grab our clip that we filmed. In my case it's the clip of the coffee table. You should be aware that when you want to track your footage natively in After Effects, you should have at least a surface with enough texture on it, like I got here with the coffee table. You see the wood structure has enough data, so the tracking can be done in a good way. So I come over here to tracker and say follow camera or track camera. And now we're gonna wait for the actual tracking and go here into effects, over here to our effects. You can see the progress it's doing. So now we gotta wait. So after our track is done, we can scroll around and see that we have all these little dots on our table, so we can go into our footage and select a nice point which looks flush with the table. Click on it in between and you see these 3 points here. We can now right click on that and say we want to get a solid and a camera. So now we got that. And now to the normalize track part. As you can see, our coordinates and rotation is like all over the place. And to normalize this, we got this free script called normalize track. So if I go in here and rename this to ground and say normalize track, thing got normalized. We got like normal numbers here and normal rotation. Now we can go in and align it a little bit even further, scale it a little bit more down. And this only gives you a reference for Blender, so you know a little bit better what scale your surface is that you can work with. And if we look now, you don't have to hear my breathing. Wait a second. And if we look now, you can see the surface is tracked to our table. Not quite that difficult. And the cool thing that we can do now is that we got our 3D tracked camera. We can go into here and grab our position and rotation or orientation of our camera and copy this into Blender via an add-on that is called AE to Blend. And it's like $10 on the Blender market, and it saves you a lot of time and effort to track this in Blender. I know you can do this in Blender, but I'm more familiar with the tracking in After Effects. But the steps are roughly the same. But with this add-on you can say I want to create a camera. So, and there you got your camera. Obviously it's in the wrong format. It's 1920 by 1080, but you can say you want to have a 1080 by 1920. So, and if we set our playback to 726, because that's our footage, like our footage is 726 26 frames long. now got, if we go out of the camera, got our camera move straight into Blender, beautifully. But what about the plane? So we can go back into After Effects and click on our plane and say we want all of these properties, copy them, go back into Blender and create a plane. And then voila, there's the plane. So, but there's one problem, like if we look at frame 120 and at frame 120 over here, you can see that the plane is almost fully in frame here, and here it's not, because in After Effects the camera assumes that it's a full frame camera, but I filmed this clip with my iPhone, so the sensor is a lot smaller, and so the focal length of the camera isn't the right size. You experience this with a full frame camera and an APS-C camera. So if it's 50mm on a full frame, it's like, I don't know, 75 on a APS-C sensor and so on. And so you got to fiddle around a little bit with the settings here. I think it was like 32.2 or something. No, 32.2 for the camera lens. So if we go back here, it's even smaller, like 30. And if you want to make sure you're having the right camera options, like your focal length, you can select your plane and give it like an Eevee, a new texture, which is emissive, and say under the film properties right here, you have a transparent background. And if you render your image now, got like a transparent JPEG, you can save this as like test, save as image, go into After Effects, go to your project, double click, and select your test plane, import it, and put it over your ground plane. As you can see, it almost fits the original lens, which is quite good. You can trigger it around, but for now I'm leaving it at this because it's only a demonstration. If I would do it correctly, I would do it in a better way. But that's essentially the basic setup for the tracking. So if I would render out this sequence now, I would get a track that is similar to my track in After Effects. So later on I can just disable the ground and would have this plane tracked in After Effects, like the 3D part. And from here on, it's really up to your imagination. So let's start with the actual 3D part now. And for this, I have to go to my asset browser because I have an asset I want to use, like this. So this is a geometry node setup. Let me show it quickly. Like geometry nodes. So as you can see, it's starting from an icosphere. In here you got your transform and other nodes. I will explain it more later on. Like, let me first show you the assets I used for this. So we got two types of rocks which are scattered on the sides of the floating island, and a crystal which is scattered on top, as well as a selection of grass that is scattered on top. But how do we actually set up this? So the transform node in here is just if I want to scale it in a direction, it scales. And the cool thing about this setup is, as you can see, we don't actually scale the whole object like the rocks and the crystals and such. We only scale the icosphere, and the rest is distributing itself accordingly on the new scaling. So if I would scale it normally, like this, everything would get bigger, and we don't want that because we want to get more variation like this. So we can say we want to scale it like this, and everything else distributes accordingly, beautifully. But how do you actually make this? I watched a tutorial on that, and it's quite simple if you get the hang of it. Geometry nodes at first were also kind of red flag for me, as well as shader nodes in the beginning. So we start with our icosphere and go into our transform node. After this, we want to distribute points on our faces. So our icosphere is now made up of points, and the distribution of them is randomly, and the density is like 400. If we turn it down, as you can see on top here with the grass, it gets less. Excuse me. So after this, we want to put an instance on these points. So in our case, it's the grass collection. So you just pull in your grass collection like this, and it appears in here. And you can say you want this grass collection as your instance objects. And after this, you want to put your instances into a join geometry node and into the group output. That's basically it. But the difficult part kinda is how to distribute it only on the top and only on the sides, like for the rocks. And that's done with some math. I myself hate math, but it's not that complicated, I will assure you. So you got like an combine XYZ node, a greater than, and a separate XYZ node and a normal node. The normal node says we want to distribute our instances on the normal direction, so it's facing like 90 degrees up if the face is pointing 90 degrees up. After that, we want to separate our three axes like X, Y, and Z. So if we activate this, I should select an object. So we want to separate our axes and say if the Z value is greater than X threshold, like if I move it around, you can see more grass appears or less grass appears. Then we want to combine it back and put it in our selection, so it's only on our separated selection. And we want to select the value, so it's the top facing, like if I select again, it's this value, we only want it in that direction. And the last setup is, as I said, for the rocks here, so I can say I want more or less rocks, like 0 rocks or all of them. So, and as I told you, it's like the opposite, so we don't want to say more than, we want to say less than Z. So everything around is getting rocks. 5 again, so it's back at the original value. You can, if you want, put in a rotation and rotate Euler node to rotate these instances in a particular way. And after this, you can also put a random scale value if you want. After this, it's back up join geometry and put it back into a group output. So that's basically it. So now you can go ahead and place your island like wherever you want. And just let me take this off. But like one thing is, if you duplicate it with Shift D and now go into here and say like, okay, now I want to have this scaled in that direction, you see both of them get scaled. But you just can copy the geometry node group and it makes it a separate one. So now you can say I want to scale it 1.6 times on the Z-axis, so it's a little bit taller than this one. So now you got that. So, and basically that's how you're gonna set up your scene now. So we're back. Yes, That looks good to me in my view. As you can see with these floating islands, you don't have to position them onto your original ground layer because they're floating islands. They can be anywhere where you want in your tracked footage. Next we want to set up our plane on the ground. So to create our ground plane we can select like any geometry node setup, and we want to give it a new one like this one, and we just want to select like the 4 one, and now we got our cube here, which is the holder of the object for our geometry nodes modifier, and now we can say like we want to have a mesh circle and to put it like this and fill it with triangles. And as we can see, if we subdivide it, we get a nice big circle with our geometry. You can scale it down like onto one very side, or scale it in every other direction except for the that direction. So like this, and now we got our ground plane. So now it should look better. Yes, more evenly. Yes, so that's our ground plane, and because of the fact that this is a separate geometry node setup with the same things, we can say you want less of these crystals and maybe a different seed, because now we want to put on like our temple mesh or something. And actually for the Star Destroyer and the temple I made use of some Sketchfab assets which were free. So for now I take like different asset I got on my asset browser, for example these Ewing, which I also got from Sketchfab. So if we rotated it and scale it accordingly, we can put it like above here, this. So yeah, maybe here. So yeah, now it fits perfectly. So if we go now, play back our animation, now you can see everything is in place. And if we render our test frame 120 again and hit render image, so now we can see our frames are, or our frame is rendered, and we want to save it as our test frame again. Go back, yeah, and as you can see our 3D assets are now in After Effects. But as you may also see is that the lighting is completely off. So let's fix that now, and for this we want to use cycles and set it to GPU rendering because it's faster. 128 samples, 32 for better or for easier visibility, but still we got no lights. So as I told you, many people asked me how I got this light so perfect, and it's quite easy because I knew, like if I go into my shader editor and go into world, I knew I could use an environment texture, so an HDRI, and I simply used this one, which you can get from HDRI Haven, because as you can see when I plug it in, it got the light setup which I got in my living room. So if we go and enable our background film like this, you can see we got the yellowish overlights and a big window over here. So if we zoom in, we got like the top-down lights and the lights, the daylight from the left. And if we look at my footage, I got like daylight from the left and warm light from the top. But to get this a little bit cleaner or better, the final result, just disable this. I went ahead and also emulated my ceiling light, like these 4 lights. I emulated them. So I went back into Blender, went over here and put up 4 point lights, which I set, actually I set the first 2 to a white color, like this, and I guess I made them like 250 or something. Actually don't remember. And then kinda eyeballed it where they would be in the scene. So like this. And for the other 2s, I set them to a warm orange. Went in here, copied the hex code. Copied the hex code. Went to the last one and pasted it. So the light setup would be similar to the one I got in my living room. And if you go back to our frame 120 and render this frame again, in best case with transparent light or background, and wait for it to render. And save this frame again as our test frame. Go back into After Effects. We can see the light matches perfectly, like with the reflection on the crystals and the light from the top, like the yellowish lights. Or maybe now it's kind of different. I should have put the ceiling lights a bit more to the left, so the yellowish light would fit better all around. But just you get the hang of it, how I set up the light. And that's basically it. Now I could go ahead, add more detail and more floating islands and stuff, and get my track right. So that's everything. Nothing fancy here. I know a bit cost intensive if you don't got like After Effects or don't want to buy the add-on, but as I said, you can do this natively in Blender. No magic right there. So I hope you learned something, enjoyed it, and thanks for watching.